I didn't go to my ex-husband's funeral to make a scene. I went because after 15 years of silence, I needed to see for myself that he was truly gone. The man who once promised me the world and left me with a foreclosure notice and a cracked wedding band was finally being lowered into the ground by the same people who cheered when he left. I wore black, of course, but not because I was mourning. I wore it because it was clean, sharp, and made people question whether I had come in peace or with purpose. I arrived just as they were beginning the service, slipping into the back pew with a quiet grace that unsettled the entire second row. They turned. Oh, they turned. His sister Gloria gasped. His cousin Denise, the one who told everyone I drove him away, gave me a look like she'd seen a ghost in pearls. I sat anyway, head high, shoulders back, hands folded neatly in my lap like the woman I had to become after he left me for someone 10 years younger, with a Pinterest wedding board and a fragile ego. The pastor spoke about forgiveness, about Richard's resilient spirit, how he faced challenges head-on, and I had to stop myself from snorting into my clutch. This man once spent 3 months hiding unpaid bills in his car so I wouldn't find them in the mailbox. Resilient? Please. And then she stood up. Clarissa, the second wife, younger, blonder, still wearing the grief like a designer shawl that didn't quite fit her shoulders. She took the podium with a shaky breath and said, "He was the love of my life." I blinked slowly, calculated just how many times I'd heard those same words in divorce depositions I'd transcribed, back when I was still paying off the debt he left behind. The room nodded along as if she were the widow of a saint, instead of a woman who once blocked my number so her husband wouldn't be distracted. They all seemed to forget that I was the one who built the man she married, that I held his hand through 3 layoffs, 1 bankruptcy, and the death of his mother, that I stayed when no one else would. And yet, there I was, seated behind the floral arrangements, barely acknowledged, an afterthought in a room of curated sympathy. Then came the laughter, quiet at first, a ripple of whispers. I heard someone say, "Can you believe she showed up?" Another added, "Guess she wants to make sure he's really dead." I didn't flinch. I didn't rise. I let it settle, let it curl around me like smoke. Because I wasn't there for them. I wasn't there for closure. I was there for confirmation. To watch a chapter close. To sit in the presence of the same family that called me a mistake and see how they acted when the man they protected couldn't protect them from the truth anymore. The service ended, people filtered out, hugs, tears, the kind of polite sorrow reserved for people who never really knew the mess. And just when I stood to leave, a sharply dressed man in a charcoal suit stepped forward and said, "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Evelyn Monroe?" My breath caught, not because of the name, but because I hadn't heard anyone use it in nearly 2 decades. "Yes," I replied. "Mr. Denton's attorney will need to speak with you privately. His will named you as a primary beneficiary." And just like that, the room stopped breathing. I didn't turn to see their faces. I didn't need to. I just picked up my purse, smoothed my dress, and followed the lawyer into a room full of secrets I didn't ask for, but was absolutely ready to inherit. The door to the funeral home's side office closed with a quiet click, and suddenly I wasn't the woman in the back pew anymore. I was the name on the envelope no one saw coming. The lawyer, a man with silver at his temples and a voice like clean gravel, extended his hand and said, "Miss Monroe, I'm Jordan Ellis, executor of Richard Denton's estate." I nodded, calm on the outside but bracing for impact underneath, because whatever this man was about to say wasn't just about legal matters. It was about resurrection, not of Richard, but of all the memories I'd spent years burying. He opened a leather folder, his tone smooth and deliberate. "Mr. Denton left a revised will dated 6 months prior to his passing. You are named as the sole beneficiary of his private holdings." I blinked once. "Come again?" He adjusted his glasses. "He left his secondary real estate, a retirement fund, and a private trust. In your name?" I wanted to laugh, to scream, to ask what kind of twisted joke Richard was trying to play from beyond the grave, but instead I said, "Why?" Jordan's mouth twitched into the smallest almost smile. "He wrote a letter. Would you like to read it here or take it home?" I held out my hand. "Here." He passed me a single envelope with my name written in Richard's handwriting. I stared at it. That damn handwriting, all looping arrogance and underlined regret. I opened it slowly. "Evelyn," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I know you, and I do, you came to my funeral not because you miss me, but because you wanted to make sure I didn't get the last word. I rolled my eyes. So here's the truth. Clarissa never knew the real me. Not like you did. You saw the worst of me, and you stayed longer than you should have. I was cruel, selfish, and a coward. You deserved more than I ever gave you. So, I'm giving it now, in the only way I can. I swallowed hard. He continued, I never updated the family, because I knew they'd tear you apart for this. But you earned what's left of me. You earned every cent with every sleepless night and every broken promise I forced you to forgive. Don't feel guilty. Take it. Build something. Be better than I was. You always were. No closing, no love, just his name. No apology either, but maybe this was the best he could manage. Jordan waited silently as I folded the letter and slipped it into my purse. I stood. What now? He smiled politely. We'll contact you with transfer documents this week. There may be some questions from the family. Let them ask, I said, voice low and steady. Let them wonder why the woman they mocked walked away with everything but the corpse. When I walked out of that room, the funeral had mostly cleared. Just a few stragglers, family I recognized from grainy wedding photos and bitter Thanksgivings. They looked up, they waited. I didn't speak. Just walked past Clarissa, who stood pale and stiff by the coffee table. Her eyes followed me like a hawk, realizing too late it had flown into a trap. And then, Gloria. What did he say? She asked, almost choking. I smiled. He said my name. And then I left. Not in triumph, in clarity, because for the first time since he left me, Richard finally gave me what no one else in his life ever had. Acknowledgement, and I wasn't going to waste it explaining myself to people who still thought I should be grateful for surviving his betrayal. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of excitement, not even because of grief, but because of the quiet, a different kind of quiet, the kind that wraps around your ankles like river weeds when the water looks still on top, but something underneath is shifting. I stared at the ceiling in the condo I'd scraped together after the divorce. A one-bedroom with 2 thin walls and a balcony that overlooked nothing but a strip mall and a bus stop. And all I could think about was the way Gloria's mouth fell open when I said, he said my name. Because that moment didn't just surprise them, it rearranged the narrative they'd clung to for years. In their story, I was the mistake, the ex, the woman he left behind so he could move on and find a version of himself worth loving. But that one envelope had rewritten the entire final chapter. I knew by morning it would spread like fire through that family, and I was right. By 8:30 a.m., I had 2 missed calls from unknown numbers and 1 voicemail from Clarissa's sister that started with, Evelyn, we really need to talk, and ended with, this isn't what he wanted, which told me everything I needed to know. They weren't looking for answers, they were looking for control. Again, but this time I wasn't offering any. I made tea. I watered the plants. I read the letter again. Not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted to see it one last time before I put it away forever. And then I made an appointment with Monica Reeves, my lawyer, my shield. She had helped me through the divorce, the foreclosure, the custody battle for a dog Richard forgot to feed but still tried to keep out of spite. When I walked into her office and slid the letter across the table, she read it with the kind of focus only seasoned women have, the kind that sees through loopholes and sentiment in the same glance. You know this is ironclad? She asked. It's written clearly, signed, notarized, dated. I nodded. I don't need revenge, I said, but I'm not giving anything back either. You don't owe them a word, she said. They'll try to make this public, paint you as vindictive. I smiled. Let them. The truth is loud enough. She filed the documents, called the estate manager, scheduled a follow-up. It was done, just like that. And on the way out, I passed a young woman in the waiting room, tears in her eyes, holding a stack of papers labeled Emergency Protection Order. She looked at me. I looked at her. And for a moment, we both understood something most people never do, that freedom is expensive, but not impossible. That night, Clarissa showed up at my door, unannounced, in heels too high for confrontation and makeup too perfect for mourning. Evelyn, she said, we need to talk. I didn't move. No, we don't. You think this is fair, she said, her voice rising. You think just because he named you? He didn't name me, I said. He remembered me. That's different. She laughed, bitter, sharp. You're not even grieving him. I did that already 19 years ago. When he left and told everyone I was the problem. Her lips quivered. He said I was his peace. I nodded. He told me I was his truth. She didn't have a response. She just stood there, small and angry in the doorway of a life she thought she owned. And I closed the door gently, not with rage, not with spite, but with his grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like a locked door, and a woman who no longer needs to explain why it's closed. I thought that would be the end of it, that after Clarissa's failed attempt at intimidation, the family would back off, lick their wounds in private, and accept that the man they tried to make a myth had left behind a truth they couldn't spin. But people like them don't take correction well. Not when they've invested years in erasing the parts of the story that don't make them look like the center. So I wasn't surprised when 2 days later, I got served. A formal request to pause the estate disbursement, claims of confusion, of mental instability, of possible coercion. I brought the letter straight to Monica, who read it, sighed once, and said, "They're trying to bury you in paperwork now." "Let them," I said. "I've been buried before. I always dig myself out." What they didn't know, what Clarissa never learned, is that silence is not the same as surrender. I had spent years being polite, being quiet, not because I didn't have words, but because I knew most people only listen when it's too late. This time, I'd let the documents speak. Monica filed a countersuit for slander and obstruction. We submitted every piece of proof, every statement, every timeline. I was ready. And for once in my life, I wasn't the one left explaining myself while everyone else played innocent. That week, a notice went out to all heirs per Richard's final letter and supplemental documents. The primary beneficiary of the estate, including assets and rights to any intellectual property or business interest, was me. It wasn't about the money. God knows I'd built a life without his help. It was about the principle, the truth, the memory that for once I hadn't imagined it all. He remembered, and he made it known. The reaction online was swift. Gloria's cousin posted something vague about betrayals from the past resurfacing. Clarissa posted a quote about karma wearing heels. And Richard's brother, of all people, messaged me privately. He said, "I never liked how they treated you. I always knew you were the one." I didn't reply, because validation, this late, isn't a gift. It's a late apology with a bow taped to the side. That Saturday, I got invited to the second memorial event, hosted by Clarissa, of course, at some hotel ballroom with a rented string quartet and monogram napkins. I didn't go, but I did send flowers, one bouquet, all white lilies, no card, just the silence they tried to bury me in. That evening, Monica called to confirm the judge had denied their injunction. The estate transfer would proceed. "You're free," she said. "Legally, financially, completely." I said thank you, not to her, to myself, for waiting, for surviving, for not folding when the pressure came. That night I lit a candle on my windowsill, not for Richard, but for the version of me who once sat alone after the divorce, crying over a man who never came back, the woman who wore makeup to court so they wouldn't call her bitter, who rehearsed her sentences in the mirror so they wouldn't say she was crazy, who signed the papers, packed the boxes, and built a whole new life in silence. I honored her, because she did the work. She earned this peace. She was the reason I could look Clarissa in the face and not flinch. The reason I didn't have to post a single thing online to defend myself. My name had already been spoken, and sometimes that's all it takes to burn the lie to the ground. One truth, one signature, one final act of remembrance that rewrites everything they tried to forget. It took a while for the dust to settle, not because the truth wasn't loud enough, but because people like Clarissa don't process grief. They perform it, sculpt it, decorate it. And when the audience claps for the wrong monologue, they throw a tantrum in pearls and stilettos, pretending it's all a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, anything but a loss of control. And in the weeks after the legal confirmation, I noticed how the tone shifted, how the ones who used to whisper about me in the back pews suddenly smiled too brightly in the produce aisle. How my name, which once sat at the bottom of every seating chart, was now somehow too loud to be ignored, and I didn't respond. Didn't entertain their awkward apologies or invitations to reconnect, because I knew better than to mistake shame for sincerity, and besides, I had other things to do, because with the estate finalized, Monica and I got to work setting up the foundation Richard outlined in the last part of his will, a scholarship for underrepresented journalism students, the very dream I had encouraged him to pursue back when we were young and idealistic and still believed the truth alone could change the world. And yes, he credited me by name. Said the idea came from the woman who first told him that words meant nothing without accountability, and that meant more to me than any property or payout, because it proved that, even after the divorce, even after the silence, even after the years where I was erased in public, but remembered in private, he never forgot who helped shape him. And that was enough, more than enough. And the launch event was simple, intimate, held at the local college auditorium with a slideshow, a few testimonials, and one empty chair at the front marked "reserved for her." And when they called me up to speak, I didn't read from a script. I didn't cry. I just looked out at the rows of students, some of them holding notebooks like they were afraid to miss a single word. And I said, "Your story is yours. Even when others try to rewrite it, even when they laugh or delete your name or call you too sensitive, too much, too extra, your truth is a home, and you get to decide who's allowed inside." And when I stepped off the stage, the applause was quiet, but it was real, not for what I'd inherited, but for what I'd endured. And that night, back at home, I sat by the window with a cup of mint tea and the program folded neatly in my lap, and I thought about how far I'd come from the woman who once cried in a rented car outside the funeral, wondering if showing up had been a mistake. And now here I was, not just showing up, but being called up, being named, being seen, and that's what they never expected. Not that I'd outlast them, but that I'd outgrow the shame they tried to stitch into my skin like it was something I had to wear forever. But I took it off, quietly, defiantly, and replaced it with dignity that didn't need a spotlight. Just a steady chair, a microphone, and a name that finally stood on its own, unshaken, undeniable, and absolutely unforgettable. The first letter arrived a week after the scholarship launch, not handwritten like the apology notes people send when they're truly sorry, but typed, printed on cheap stationery, and signed with a name that still thought itself significant, Clarissa. And I nearly laughed opening it, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Because people like her always come back when the headlines start to favor someone else's narrative. And the letter, in its polished, passive-aggressive elegance, was less an apology and more an attempt at revision, as if she could rewrite the events of the funeral, the will, the smirk on her lips when I walked in, and the silence she offered when my name was first spoken by the lawyer, and it read, "I hope this message finds you well. I understand that there have been some complexities regarding the estate, and I think it's important for us to find common ground, especially for the sake of Richard's legacy." And I folded the paper slowly, one line at a time, until it was small enough to disappear into the kitchen trash without ceremony. Because Clarissa didn't want common ground, she wanted a stage, and now that her spotlight had dimmed, she thought proximity to my story might illuminate her own again. But I had already made peace with what was mine, and there was no space in that peace for opportunists dressed in pastels and regret. And then came the calls. Not directly from her, of course, but from those mutual friends who always claim neutrality. The ones who say, "She's really struggling," as if that's an excuse to revisit harm, as if suffering is currency and I should trade my boundaries for her comfort. And one even said, "She's not the same since the will." And I said, "Neither am I." And that ended the conversation quickly, and I wasn't bitter, not anymore, but I was resolute. Because growth doesn't always come with softness, it comes with firmness, with saying no when yes would cost too much, with remembering how it felt to be laughed at beside a coffin and deciding never to let anyone diminish your grief again. And around this time, Tyler came to visit, my godson who'd driven me to that funeral in the first place, and we sat on the balcony with lemonade and leftover pound cake. He asked me, "Do you regret going?" And I shook my head, slow and sure. "No, baby, I regret staying quiet for so long." And he nodded, like he understood the weight behind that silence. And then he pulled out a folder from his bag, said, "I've been working on something," and inside were sketches for a podcast series, stories about women who'd been erased, sidelined, rewritten by people who thought they'd never speak up, and he wanted me to help narrate the first episode, to tell my story in my own voice. and I hesitated. Not because I was afraid, but because it felt like a final step, the moment where pain becomes testimony. And finally I said yes, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that survival is not just enduring, it's echoing. And my voice, long silenced by shame and dismissal, was now being invited to shape something that could outlive every room that ever laughed at me. And that night, I sat down at my desk, turned on the mic Tyler set up, and began recording, not with tears, not with trembling, but with the steadiness of a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to say. The first episode launched on a quiet Tuesday with a black title card and white letters. They laughed at me at my ex's funeral. No fanfare, but within hours, it surged. Messages poured in, women saying thank you for saying what I couldn't. That hit deep. For years I thought silence was strength, but this was liberation. By Thursday, it was trending. A podcast newsletter featured it. An advocacy group asked me to join a panel. The voice they once dismissed had become impossible to ignore. Clarissa sent a hand-delivered letter wanting to share her side. I let the wind take it. Her side had dominated for too long. Then a package arrived. No return address, just my name in Richard's handwriting. Inside, an old cassette labeled Practice Vows 1987 and a photo of me in my first thrift store dress. I played the tape. His voice promised, "I'll honor you, even when the world forgets how." I let it play, not out of longing, but to remember the good without inviting the rest. That weekend at the panel, I told a room of women the truth. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's a whisper that says, "This time, I'm writing the ending." An older woman hugged me after. "You said what I've held for 40 years, she said. I held her back, because women like us aren't footnotes. We're the ones who endured, who rose, who now speak. And as I walked home alone that night, heels firm, heart full, I knew they'd never laugh me out of my own story again. The morning after the funeral, I stood in my kitchen, sunlight warming the tile, and realized I wasn't just free of Richard. I was free of the version of me who thought silence was safer than truth. The lawyer's email was waiting. Final transfer confirmed. My name alone on the deed. No more tethering. No more shrinking. Tyler brought tea like he did every Thursday. Asked if I was nervous about the second episode, the one where I'd break the fairy tale in half. "Not nervous," I said. "Ready." That evening, I sat on the balcony, jasmine climbing, mint thriving, and thought of all the women still quiet in their kitchens, still holding stories that deserved light. I whispered a prayer, not to be remembered, but to remind. Later, a message came in from a woman named Eloise. "Next time, I'll stand." I smiled. The ripple was working. That night, I lit a final candle. Not for him, not for revenge, but for the woman I'd become. Not erased, not small, just sovereign.